Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. I am very excited about today's video because we're going to be talking all about neutral eyeshadow palettes and specifically how to pick out a perfect neutral palette. This can be a very tricky thing. As much as you think a neutral is a neutral, they are not the same. We all have different preferences, we all have different skin tones, and what works for one of us might not work for others. I actually think picking out a neutral palette is a little bit harder than even a colorful one because if you're into color, you probably don't mind experimenting a little bit, but if you are a neutral person, we can be very set in our ways when it comes to our neutral palettes. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to share with you guys some of my very favorite neutral palettes, including some really popular ones I'm sure you guys have heard of before. We'll be kind of comparing undertones, talking a little bit about that, and then also comparing some swatches of the different eyeshadow palettes. I hope this video is going to be helpful for you guys. Before we jump into it, I want to give a special welcome to any of you that are new here. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you find it helpful, and I hope that you'll consider subscribing before you leave. Also, make sure your notifications are turned on. And with that said, let's get right to it. So I want to start off by explaining to you kind of the inspiration behind this video idea. It actually came from one of you, my lovely viewers. In one of my recent videos, I was trying out a neutral palette and talking about how much I love this neutral palette. We will talk about this palette today, which I am coincidentally wearing on my eyes today. But you had mentioned after watching my review, you went out and bought the palette and it didn't work out for you. You thought it was a little bit too warm for what you were looking for. First off, I felt terrible. I always feel awful when my recommendations don't work out for you guys, but I've heard this comment before. I don't know if I call this a complaint. It was very kind, but I have heard it before in regards to neutral eyeshadow palettes. And so I was kind of thinking to myself, what could I do better as a content creator in my reviews to keep this situation from happening? I think I could do a better job of being more thorough and talking about especially neutral palettes, talking about their undertones. Are they warm? Are they cool? So that's kind of what we're gonna attempt to do today. So I have gone through my collection. I have picked out 15 of some of my favorite neutral palettes, some of, I'm sure, your favorite neutral palettes, ones that I know you guys probably have seen and love. I'm gonna share with you guys what my top 5 palettes are, and then we're gonna go through each of the palettes and talk about their undertones and where they fall on a scale from cool to warm, because that I think is the most important thing and whether or not a neutral palette works out for you based on what your preferences are. Do you like your palettes more warm? Do you like them to lean a little bit more cool? I have a wide spectrum covered here. I actually like both. I like cool and warm, but I generally lean towards more warm toned palettes. I think that has something to do with my preferences, with my undertone. So I have come up with a scale or a range that we're going to measure up each of these palettes to. 1 being extremely cool, 10 being extremely warm. And we're gonna rank each of these palettes on this scale, and from here on out, I'm hoping to use this scale anytime I am reviewing or doing a first impressions on a neutral eyeshadow palette to help you guys kind of gauge whether or not the palette might work for you. So really quickly, before we get into the 15 palettes, one thing I think it's important to consider if you're looking to buy a neutral palette or wondering if something's gonna work for you or not. Number 1, you need to know what you prefer. Do you like something right in the middle that's not too warm or too cold? Do you find that cool tones don't look very good on you? Or are you the opposite? Do you find that warm tones you just like to stay away from, you don't think that they work well on you? It's important to know what your preferences are. So let's start off with my top 5 neutral palettes. Now these are not in any particular order. I love all these palettes kind of interchangeably, just depending on my mood or the day. So the first one is the Natasha Denona Glam Palette. I know I've talked about this palette a lot for you guys before. So here is a peek at this one. I'm gonna insert for you guys right here a close-up of the palette and the swatches so you can see how the shades compare to each other swatched on my arm. This has been a long-time favorite of mine, and I like this one especially when I am in the mood for more cool tones. So let's bring up that scale. From 1 to 10, I would rank this at a 3 on the scale from cool to warm. It definitely leans more on the cool tone side. I think the only shade in here I would truly consider a warm tone is this bronze right here. A lot of the shades sit at like a level 5. They're just right there in the middle. They're not necessarily warm or cool, but there are a lot of tones in here that are really, really cool, like 1, 2, or 3s. So as a whole, I decided to rank this one at a level 3. I think this is the coolest tone palette that I'll be mentioning today. I do have a few other palettes that I consider cool tones, one of those being the Of Quartz palette from ColourPop. That one I would consider a 1 on a scale from warm to cool, but I don't actually like that palette very much, and I think it's because I don't like very, very cool tones on myself. So this one I do still love. It's kind of like the very lowest level of cool that I will go on myself. It's a great palette. I love all of my Natasha Denonas, and this is one of my very favorites from her. I do want to mention, for those of you looking for a cool tone palette, maybe the Natasha Denona is I think $69 price range is out of your budget right now. Alter Ego makes a great alternative for this palette. I will be sure to link that one down below in case you're interested. The next neutral palette in my top 5 is from Patrick Ta. This is the Patrick Ta Major Dimensions Original Eyeshadow Palette. Now this one is on the opposite spectrum. This might be the warmest palette that I'm mentioning today. Actually, I think I do have a level 10. This one I ranked at a 9.5. It is very, very, very warm. There is not anything even close to a cool tone in this palette. It's a very rich, very warm eyeshadow palette. I love it. It's beautiful, but everything in here is definitely on the warm tone side. I will insert for you guys right here a close-up of the palette and the swatches so you can see how the shades compare to each other, and also maybe compare it to some of the other palettes that we'll be swatching today, including that Natasha Denona one, which was much more cool. I really love this eyeshadow palette. I am a big fan of warm tones on myself. I think they are so pretty and rich. I just think they're easy to work with. I generally find that, especially when it comes to really, if you're doing something deep and smoky, I generally think that warmer tones like this work a little bit better than cool tones. That might just be my preferences talking. I love really rich, warm outer corner shades. I also love warm tones up through the crease, and these are definitely warm, like these 3 shades right here, which I would consider more transition shades or lighter tones. This is a really fun palette because there's so much dimension in here. You get a lot of different finishes in here, both with the matte. You also have these like creamy formulas right here that are so interesting and so beautiful, especially to build some of these rich tones on top of. I love these very sparkly bronzes, have a couple glitter toppers in here, and then some really beautiful mattes. Great formulations. Definitely a good palette for those of you that really prefer your warm tones. I do think this is a more advanced palette to work with. Not that it's hard to work with, but it takes a little bit of time to get the different textures to kind of work together. It's not the fastest eyeshadow palette to put on because the textures are so very different from most of my other more traditional eyeshadow palettes. That said, I love this one. I think it is so fantastic. If you're into warm tones and you don't mind spending a little bit of money, this thing is a little pricey, you will love this one. It is amazing. Next one I wanted to share is the Fill and Bubbly palette from ColourPop. This is the palette that inspired this video. It's also one that I'm wearing on my eyes today because I wanted to show you guys what this palette looks like. The comment mentioned something that it might have been my lighting, and I actually think that you might be correct. I have actually tried to adjust my settings so my lighting's warmed up a little bit, because I do think that my lighting down here this time of year can be very cool in tone because I have the artificial lights on. I just don't have a lot of light coming out of this window until we get into the spring and summer. So I've tried to make that adjustment. So this palette I ranked it as 7.5. I do think it is a warmer palette. It's not extremely warm, definitely not as warm and rich as the Patrick Ta. You do have these 2 tones right here that I almost think this one leans a little bit cool, but everything else in here does go a little bit warm, especially these 2 transition shades. They're very, very warm, and while they're light in tone, they're gonna make any other shade you put on top of them pull a little bit more warm toned. I personally love that, but it's not a cool tone palette, or I would say even a neutral, like level 5 palette. It is leaning on the warm tone side. I'll insert a close-up for you guys right here, along with the swatches, so you can see how they all look swatched and then compare them to some of the other palettes. I am a huge fan of this palette. I've only had it for a few months, and this has quickly risen to the top of my entire eyeshadow palette collection. I love all the mattes in here, but what I love most about this palette are these 3 shimmers. They are kind of the lid shimmers of my dreams. They all have the perfect reflective quality, undertones. They're all just a little bit different. So today I'm actually wearing this one all over the lid, and then a tiny bit of this like light kind of icy champagne just on my inner corner. In my crease I have a combination of these 2 shades, and then this one is kind of smoking out that outer corner, and then this one just a little bit more closely to the lash line. It is so good if you like your more warm tones. This is definitely a new favorite of mine. Down to my last 2 in my top 5. One of those is gonna be this one right here. This is the Nabla Side by Side palette. I was not sure about this palette the first time I got it. It was one of the first Nabla palettes that I had ever tried, but Nabla has since become one of my very favorite eyeshadow formulas. I think next to like Natasha Denona, Nabla might be my second favorite eyeshadow formula, and this is one of their very best palettes. I absolutely love this one. On my scale, I would rank this one at a 6.5. This one also leans warm, but there are some shades in here that are a little bit more cool. Namely this bottom row right here, they're all very, very cool. And then you have a couple shades I would say are like a solid level 5 or even 4.5. So this one does give you some variety from cool to warm. So sometimes you like to go very cool toned, other times you like to go very warm toned. This might be a good one if you like to kind of mix it up a little bit. Here is a close-up of the palette for you guys, along with some swatches so you can see how the shades all look compared to each other. It's a beautiful palette. There is a lot of variety in finishes in here, especially when it comes to the shimmers. There's some that are a little bit more sparkly, more glitter toppers, others that are traditional foiled metallics. Such a great palette though, if you like a little bit of variety in your neutral shadows, but you don't mind a little bit of warmth. This is a really good one, I would recommend. Last one in my top 5 is also from Nabla. It's the Nabla Cutie Nude palette. I love this palette so much. I know I've talked about it a lot if you've been watching me for the last couple of years. This is a very interesting palette. It's different than any of the other palettes I'm talking about today because it has some pink in it, but I would say it's more nude or neutral than pink. Like it just has like a hint of pink in it, which actually made this one kind of hard to place. It's not necessarily warm, like in a brown warm, but it's also not cool. So I ended up ranking this one at a 5.5. Kind of sits right there in the middle, but just know that some of these shades are very, very slightly pink in tone without being obviously pink. I'll insert the swatches for you guys right here. Hopefully that will explain things a little bit better. You do get some warmth in here. This bronze is quite warm. I do think this dark brown is also a little bit on the warm side, but the black is very, very solidly like a cool tone pigmented black. So when you add this to your lash liner as a liner, it kind of grounds out the look and almost cools it off a little bit. This is such a great palette. I love the formulas in here. These two are both cream to powder formulas that they look a little bit messy in the pan, but they're so fun to work with, especially if you have more mature eyelids. They build up so nicely. They never, ever, ever, ever go patchy. That's what I love about these shades. I just find because they have that creaminess to them, you never get that stubborn patchiness that you can sometimes get as you're trying to build up depth. It's such a great palette. It's very unique. I almost didn't consider this one a neutral because they are slightly pink in tone, but the looks that come out of this palette are neutral looks. They just have a different undertone to them. So those are my thoughts on this Nabla Cutie palette. Even though it's small, even though it's kind of unique, it is one of my very, very favorites. Okay, so those were my personal top 5 favorites, but I have a lot of other neutral palettes that I also love that I wanted to mention because my guess is you guys probably maybe own some of these as well. Probably, maybe. I don't think you can say that. Again, these are in no particular order. They're just not my most favorite, but I love all of these. So let's start with one that I'm sure you guys have seen before. It is a old favorite of mine, the Persona Identity palette. I actually have the original packaging. The newer packaging is a little bit nicer than this. This is a great palette. Now this one I am ranking on my scale from cool to warm at a 4.5. I think this one leans a little bit cool, but it's kind of more there in the middle. You do have a couple of warm shades in here. I mean, you have this bright orange, but other than that bright orange, everything else in here is either cool or neutral. Here's a close-up of the palette along with the swatches on my arm so you can have a closer look at them. One thing to note with this palette, if you have this palette, hopefully you'll understand what I'm talking about, but this palette is a little bit on the smoky side. I have a hard time getting a softer, lighter neutral look out of this one because the shades are very pigmented and very rich. So I have to be very light-handed unless I'm wanting to go for depth with this one. I think for those of you with more medium to deep skin tones, that probably won't be an issue for you. But if you have a more fair skin tone and you don't like your eyeshadow looks to be too dark, this palette can go a little dark and smoky very quickly. That said, I think it's a beautiful palette. The formulas are amazing. They are so pigmented. The mattes, especially in here, are insane pigmentation. They blend beautifully. Love the Persona shimmer formula. It's not as thickly foiled and metallic. It's a little bit more smoothing on the eyelids. So those of you that have more mature eyelids might like that. But it's also not weak. It has a lot of reflective quality to it. It's just a little bit more refined of a shimmer. And looking at mine, other than the packaging around the edges, which is so dirty because I reach for this thing all the time, you would hardly know that I reach for this thing because you just barely have to tap into these shades because they're so pigmented and rich. Great neutral palette though. Okay, next up is another Natasha Denona palette, and this is the warmest one that we're talking about today. This is the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. I am ranking this one at a 10. I wanted to maybe say 9.5 because this shade almost looks cool, but let me show you guys the swatches right here. Even this shade I feel like leans a little bit on the warm side, and if you compare it with anything else in the entire eyeshadow palette, these are so incredibly warm. I mean, next level warm. If you don't like your warm tones, you probably didn't even glance twice at this thing because they are so warm, beautifully rich. I love this palette. It's a great one. I've always had small criticisms that I feel like most of these shades are kind of like mid-tone range. You don't get anything very brightening, kind of more highlight type shades, which I always love in an eye look. But that said, it's still a beautiful, beautiful palette. The bronze shades in here are so pretty. Again, same thing I said with the Glam palette. If this one is outside of your budget, but you're interested in it, Alter Ego does make a fantastic dupe for this palette, so I will link that one for you guys down below as well. Great warm palette, but definitely one that you've got to be in the mood for really intense warmth if you're going to reach for this thing. Next up is the Soft Glam palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills, an old favorite for many of us. This one I am ranking as a solid 7. I do think it leans quite warm, despite the fact that you do have a couple of shades in here that are a little bit more cool, like this rose quartz shade, this black right here, and even this brown is maybe like a little bit more of like a 4.5. However, everything else in here is quite warm. Most of the looks that come out of this palette definitely lean on the warm side. Here is a close-up of the palette and the shadows swatch so you can have a look at them. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this palette. Let me know, would you guys rank this as a 7? I was kind of waffling between a 6.5 and a 7.5, decided to land at a 7. If you are someone that knows you don't like anything warm, this probably is not going to be the palette for you because so much in here is very warm. But I do still love this palette. I actually used it recently in a video and was reminded of why this is such a favorite of so many people. Next up, I have another palette also from Anastasia Beverly Hills. This one's a little bit newer. This is the Rose Metals palette from ABH. I love this palette. I actually wasn't sure that I loved it the first time I tried it, but the more I've used it over the months, I think I've had this for like 4 or 5 months, the more it's grown on me. Now I'm ranking this one at a 6.5. This is kind of a complicated palette because you do get some shades in here that definitely are more cool toned, but then you also have some shades in here that are not just leaning warm tone, they're like level 10 warms, like these browns right here, this kind of copper color, this kind of red bronze, and then these bronzes right here, they're all very warm. You do have more warm shades in here than cool, but you can kind of mix it up. I have found as I've used this palette though that most all of the looks that I do, while I love them, they all lean a little bit on the warm side, probably because most of the shades, unless I'm just doing like this shade and this shade and this shade right here, that probably wouldn't be very warm. Anytime I want to add some richness or smoke things out with one of these shades, it really pulls the look in a warm direction. I would again say this is a good palette for those of you that like to mix it up. Sometimes you like your cool tones, sometimes you like your warm tones. Here's a close-up of the palette along with the swatches. You guys can have a look at how they look swatched. It's a great one. It did not take long for this one to rise to the top of my favorites. I actually think, like, I know these aren't ranked, but this would be very close to my top 5. Not quite there, but very close. Next up is another palette from ColourPop. This is the That's Taupe palette from ColourPop, another longtime favorite of mine. And this one, we're gonna go back to that cool tone side of the scale. I rank this at a solid 4. I do think it's just a hair warmer than the Natasha Denona Glam, but that's mainly because you don't get as many shades inside here. I've often said this is a good alternative to the Natasha Denona Glam palette. While you don't get as many shades in this palette, obviously, the looks that come out of this always remind me of the Glam palette. Here's a quick close-up of the palette along with the swatches. Hopefully you can kind of see my justification for ranking this as a 4. Most of the shades aren't extremely cool, but they all kind of lean in that direction, which is kind of why I ranked it there. Great palette. Added bonus, it's more affordable. If you like your cooler tones, I think this is one you would not be disappointed with. Another one from ColourPop is the Going Coconuts palette. I love this one. It's an old favorite. My guess is a lot of you still have this in your collection. I ended up ranking this one at a level 7. I do think it's a little bit warmer. I think it's just a hair under the Fill and Bubbly palette as far as warmth goes, because you do have some cooler shades in here, which you don't get in the Fill and Bubbly palette, especially when it comes to like the transition shade. You do have a cool tone or a neutral tone option in here. So if you don't want the look to go warm, you can start with this shade and then top it with maybe this and then like the champagne in the center, and then your look will be kind of more like a level 5. But other than these 3 shades, most of the other shades do lean a little bit on the warm tone side. I think it's a beautiful palette. I love this rose gold shade in the middle, this Super Shock formula. So beautiful. Another great affordable option. If this one was a little bit too cool for your liking, I think this would be a good alternative. Next up is the Tati Textured Neutrals palette. Now I wanted to mention this palette because I do know for those of you that are big Tati fans, probably bought this palette. It is a great quality palette. Now this is a different kind of neutral palette because you do get a full row of glitters in here along with a whole row of like bright pink shades, but other than that, everything else in here is pretty neutral. I do love this one. It is very unique. If you want a very glamorous look, this is the palette for glam, I'm telling you. Really exceptional quality. I think her quality is so fantastic across the board. So here's a close-up of the palette for you guys, along with these swatches on my arm. I think I had to leave out a couple of the glitters and a couple of the mattes because they just wouldn't fit on my arm. I do think though, like This row and this row, the shades are almost identical to each other. This one just has some glitter particles in them, whereas this one are just standard matte. So I kind of mix it up with like these last two rows, but you should be able to get the general idea of kind of what the color story of this one is with those swatches. And while it's called a neutral palette, and even I consider it a neutral palette, I actually like that you get just a couple pops of color with the pinks and even these bright oranges. I think they just add something special to the looks that come out of it. Next up is this palette from Alter Ego. This is the Sahara palette from Alter Ego. This is meant to be a dupe for the Natasha Denona Biba palette. I don't own that Natasha Denona palette, so I can't exactly compare this one to that one, but I've done a lot of dupe videos over the years of the Natasha palettes compared to some of the Alter Ego palettes, and I think they've always done a really good job. So I'm assuming that this one is pretty similar to the other ones and that it's very close to the original Natasha Denona Biba. As far as where I would rank this one, I gave this one a 7. I do think this one leans a little bit in the warm direction. These first two rows are all quite warm, and then this last row is quite cool, particularly these 3 shades right here. I mean, they are truly like level 1-2 cool tones. So this is another palette that I would recommend for those of you that kind of like to mix it up. You can get both from this palette, but as a whole, most of the looks that I reach for, and generally because I actually don't like grays on me, especially grays that don't have any warmth to them at all. I mean, these are truly like a level 1 gray. I don't think they look very good on my skin tone, so I generally like something with a little bit of warmth in it. So most of the looks that I get out of this palette are a little bit more on the warm tone side, but you do have the option in here. Here's a close-up of the palette and the swatches so you can have a look at them, see how they look compared to each other. Great little palette, great neutral color story. My only criticism or personal complaint with this palette is that you only get 2 lid shimmers in here. Actually 3 lid shimmers in here, but 2 that are a little bit more brightening. So if I use this as like my everyday palette and used it every day, I would probably burn through these 2 shimmers very, very quickly. All right, we're down to the last 2. Here's one I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the Tartelette In Bloom palette. This has been an old classic favorite that is still a really good neutral palette. So this one I ranked it a 5.5. Of all the palettes I'm talking about today, if you are someone that just likes something very simple and basic, you don't like cool tones, but you don't like warm tones, this is like the palette that's right there in the middle. I did give this a 5.5 because there are a few shades in here that are a little bit warmer in tone, more like a 7 or an 8. But other than that, everything in here is like right there around a 4 or a 5. So most of the looks that come out of this are not overly warm or overly cool. It's a beautiful palette, great formulas. Here is a close-up of it along with these swatches. Probably of all the palettes I'm talking about today, if you just don't even know what you like, but you're looking for a good place to start, this is where I would probably start because nothing in here is going to be too far on either end of the scale. Just a really good, simple, neutral palette with really great formulas. And last up is the Huda Beauty Empowered palette. This palette I ranked at a level 9. Most everything in here leans very, very strongly warm with the exception of just a couple of shades, namely this gray right here. This taupe shimmer right here I'd say sits at like a level 5, and then you of course have like this black in the corner and maybe even this like kind of rosy cooler tone. But even that one I'd say is more right in the middle. And this section over here, you guys, they are very, very warm. Don't be misled by like these 3 peach tones right here. They're very pigmented. They are very peachy and orangey in tone, and they definitely show that on the eyes. So all the looks that come out of this palette that I create are very, very warm toned. I do really like this palette. I think it's a great color story. I generally like most of the formulas inside here. There are a couple of criticisms that I've had with like these 2 cream gels right there. I didn't think they worked very good as gels. They weren't quite pigmented enough, but I couldn't really use them as like a cream shadow either. I also personally don't like these very yellowy golds on my eyes, but that's just a preference for me. Other than that, I think this is a great palette. It's a really fun one. I love these peach tones. Definitely not for those of you that are afraid of a warmer toned eyeshadow that pulls even a little bit like bright orange. This will definitely give you some of that, which I really love, but I know that's not a look for all of us. So just keep this in mind. This is a pretty warm palette. And that is it, you guys. Those are all of my top 15 neutral eyeshadow palettes. I hope that this was helpful for you guys. I hope that that scale will come in handy, not just with the eyeshadows I talked about today, but also in the future when I'm reviewing neutral palettes. I'm gonna pull that scale back out to give you guys kind of a frame of reference. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Let me give you one final reminder. If you have not yet subscribed, be sure to do that before you leave, and I will see all of you in my next video. Bye. Oh man, I hope my squeaky jacket didn't ruin this video. You guys hear that? I'm sure I'll hear from somebody in the comments below, but I'm going for a ride on my motorcycle after this. I'm just kidding. I couldn't ride a motorcycle to save my life. I can barely ride a bike. I can ride a bike. It's been a while, but I'm sure. They say you never forget, right?